Have y'all ever read a paper and said, man, that's a really good paper, but you know what? You know what I'd really like? I'd really like to see that same paper repeated again so I can see whether the results hold up. Well, if you're interested in airway management and cardiac arrest, if you really, really were into the Airways 2 trial, the one that compared iGel to endotracheal intubation and cardiac arrest, that was the British study. Well, if you're into that and you really wanted to see a repeat, stick around because I have just what you're looking for.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, where we shine the bright light of science on the darkness of current EMS clinical practice. So the paper I want to talk about today is the SAVE trial, and this is essentially a repeat of the Airways 2 trial. There are some important differences that we'll cover, but it's asking the same question. So let's start off the SAVE trial, S-A-V-E. So what does that stand for? Supraglottic Airway versus Endotracheal Intubation, SAVE. So the full title is Effect of Placement of a Supraglottic Airway Device versus Endotracheal Intubation on Return of Spontaneous Circulation in Adults with Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest in Taipei, Taiwan, a Cluster Randomized Trial. This is by Dr. Lee and his colleagues, and it was published in JAMA Netw Open in 2022, so the end of last year. So I think it's probably helpful, because this is essentially a repeat of Airways 2, to go back and take a good look at what Airways 2 was. So the citation for Airways 2 is shown on your screen. It was by Dr. Binger. Its title was Effect of a Strategy of a Supraglottic Airway Device versus Tracheal Intubation and Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest on Functional Outcome, the Airways 2 Randomized Clinical Trial. It was published in JAMA, the big JAMA, in 2018. So basically, this was a large British trial where they randomized paramedics to doing either their initial attempt or initial 2 attempts with an iGel or with endotracheal intubation using direct laryngoscopy almost exclusively. And what they wanted to see was what was the impact of airway type on 30-day functional neurologic survival using MRS. And as a reminder, MRS is the modified Rankin score. It's just a way of looking at neurologic outcomes. So that group, large trial, about 8,500 to 9,000 patients. Overall, what did that study find? Well, success within 2 attempts is higher in the iGel than intubation. Now, in that trial, it was 87% with the iGel versus 79% with intubation. They found more aspiration during or after the procedure with the iGel than they did the intubation, and they found more airway loss with iGel than intubation. But that's not what the study was about. The study was about functional neurologic outcome, and they found no difference. Specifically, their numbers were 6.8% functional neurologic outcome with intubation versus 6.4% with iGel, and overall, that difference crossed 1, therefore no statistical difference. They did find that if you look only at those patients who got advanced airway, presumably excluding those that you defibrillate and they wake up and never need an airway, that there was an advantage. The advantage was about 1.4% in favor of the iGel. That overall total 3.9 versus 2.6, but that was not their primary goal. They used an intention to treat and overall found no difference. So that brings us back to the Lee paper, the SAVE paper. And the clinical question they were asking here, we're just going to go through the PICO question. They were asking, in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in adult patients, does an initial airway management strategy using iGel compared to endotracheal intubation improved sustained ROSC at 2 hours? All right, so I think that is really a pretty good indication of what they're looking for here. Their population, well, they looked at 4 Taiwanese ALS units, and that's all of them in Taipei, apparently. They included adults aged 20 or above who were in non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and were deemed by the treating paramedics to need advanced airway management. They excluded the normal people, those who had resuscitation before the need for advanced airway. In other words, those that you zap and they wake up. Those who had advanced airways before the crew arrived. Those with a DNR. Those for whom any type of advanced airway going through the mouth was deemed inappropriate. Basically, those who already had a trach in place. And they also excluded those who were arrested before hospital arrival, but after they left the scene. In other words, they excluded those who arrested en route. So their intervention, that was an initial attempt at either an iGel or an intubation. And unlike Airways 2, where they had 2 attempts before crossing over to a rescue device, here they only had 1 attempt. The randomization was by paramedic unit as opposed to Airways 2, which was by individual treating paramedic. This was a crossover study, meaning each unit would cross over from intubation to iGel, and they would do that every 2 weeks. Their primary outcome, huge difference here between this and Airways 2. The primary outcome here was sustained ROSC for at least 2 hours. Again, in Airways 2, they were looking at functional neurologic survival according to an MRS score at 30 days. Now, that's a much more meaningful outcome. It's also much harder to collect. So, or at least much harder to power a study for. That's probably a better way of saying that. Now, the secondary outcomes in this trial, they did look at field ROSC, meaning you get pulses back in the field, but you lost them en route, survival to hospital discharge, and functional neurologic survival. So they do provide some information that we can go back and compare to Airways 2. So those were the methods. Let's dig into the results here, because essentially this is a repeat. I don't want to dig too hard into the methods of this paper. Honestly, methodologically, I think Airways 2 was a stronger paper. But because this is essentially a repeat, I think it's useful to see, well, did they get the same results? Basically, the answer is yes, no difference. So let's break down the specific outcomes to give you an idea of what we're looking at. But the bottom line picture, no difference between iGel or intubation. So overall, 936 patients were randomized either to intubation, and that was 517 in the ETI group, or supraglottic, specifically the iGel, and that was 419. Again, smaller than Airways 2, where they had about 8,000 patients. So what did they find? Overall, 26% of the total study population had ROSC. That was 26.9% in intubation, 25.8% in supraglottic. If you look at the adjusted odds ratio, particularly if you look at those results when you're not recording right next to a busy street in Fort Worth, sorry for all of the loud noises. What we haven't heard yet, though, is an F-15 or an F-35 buzzing my office, which they do about 6 to 10 times a day. It's the cost of freedom, I guess. We have a naval air station right on the other side of our office, so we're right in their flight pen. Guess we haven't seen one of those today, but hopefully you can hear me. Sustained ROSC, the adjusted odds ratio is 1.02 intubation compared to supraglottic, but the 95% confidence interval crossed 1. It went from 0.98 to 1.06, which basically means no difference. Now let's take a look at secondary outcomes, survival to hospital discharge. That was 8.5% with intubation versus 8.4% with supraglottic. As you would imagine, no difference there in the statistics. And looking at CPC scores, which the Taiwan paper looked at compared to MRS scores, essentially we're still looking at functional survival. Overall, 4.3% functional neurologic survival, 3.9 with intubation versus 4.8 with iGel, but when you look at the adjusted survival, no difference. So overall, what we see is no difference in multiple studies in important outcomes between intubation and supraglottic airways, at least in adults. I think pediatrics are a little bit different, primarily because, thank God, there just aren't as many pediatrics in cardiac arrest as there are adults. Therefore, the experience with airway management in children is much lower than it is in adults. But given that there is essentially no difference in the literature, how do we implement this in practice? Well, that's going to be a really pragmatic decision based in large part on logistics in your organization. So I'm just going to answer for my organization. Like others, not many pediatric cardiac arrest. I'm not sure the effort to train and maintain skills in intubation is worth it in pediatric patients. And we have another alternative, equivalent outcomes, easier to use. Adults is a little bit different because of that volume. There is more experience with intubation in adults than kids, and we're using intubation for not just cardiac arrest. We're using it for medical patients without cardiac arrest, traumatic patients without cardiac arrest. So the opportunity is higher for experience, and we're using it for alternative things. If you are in a system that does it well and can document that you do it well, it probably makes sense to continue with intubation. If you're in a system that cannot perform intubation well, and I don't mean ask the people in your system, because that's kind of like asking about the children from Lake Wobegon. Everybody will tell you they're all above average. I've never asked a paramedic or an emergency physician, for that matter, if they're any good at intubation, and they say no. All of us think we're really good. The question is, what do your data show? So if you're in a system that does not have good documented first pass success rate, you are absolutely on firm ground just going to a supraglottic. So notice I'm now saying supraglottic instead of iGel. Well, the reason for that is something that I want to get into in the next episode. There is a really good paper that just came out. As a matter of fact, it is still in printing, which means it's been accepted as is after peer review, but the formatting hasn't been done yet. It is truly hot off the presses, and it is exactly this. It's looking at two different types of supraglottic airway in cardiac arrest. It looks really good, and I'm really excited to dive into it and share what I find with you. So y'all, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please reach out. Let me know what you think about this paper. Let me know what you think about the pod, and let me know if you have any additional questions that you want me to dive into the literature on. Thanks, and take care.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.